Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
Thank you very much. Has everybody got a handout? Sorry. Has everybody got a handout? Right, there's a second handout going around which I've got 3 copies of, which all you need to do is basically look at. I'd like those back if it's at all possible. Right. I'd be grateful if you would refrain from putting questions during the talk. It's much easier just to have questions at the end. A lot of what I'm going to say this evening can be found on one of 3 websites: the Office for National Statistics, ONS, the Neighbourhood Statistics site, it's called NES, and the third site I've not used for this evening's talk is NOMIS, the National Online Management Information System based in Durham University. So I'm not, a lot of what I say some of what I say is my own view. I hope that it becomes clear what is my view and what is the view of what comes out of ONS. In the United Kingdom, we generally carry out censuses every 10 years. The first, I wasn't there, in 1801. We did not carry out one in 1941, and additionally a 10% sample survey was undertaken in 1966. So obviously we carried out one in 2011, and that's the predominant message from tonight. And the last one we carried out was at the turn of the millennium in 2001. The responsibility of the census lies with ONS, who are responsible to Parliament. There is some debate about the actual value, overall value of the census itself, which may mean this is the last one carried out in the current form. Subsequent censuses will probably be, or may be, in a different form. The ONS and the current government are in the throes of deciding this. There are certainly questions about whether or not they make data available at below district level. Now districts are quite heterogeneous in size. Birmingham's over 1 million people. The smallest is around 2,000. So with a variety of districts and district sizes, inevitably that causes a bit of difficulty. The lady hasn't got a handout. Right. The census questions are designed both to understand where we are as a nation and society, and also deliver services, both national and local services, according to need. The census is carried out mostly on the basis of households, sending out around 25 million questionnaires. There is plenty of publicity about the census, including census mugs, information on buses and census roadshows, much in a variety of languages. There were over 23 million households in England and Wales in March 2011. A standard form was posted to each household, and the household was expected to return it in an enclosed, prepaid large envelope. It was also possible for households to complete their form online, and a little over 16% did so. There are sheets going around, like this one, which show the distribution of that across England and Wales. It varied from over 38% in certain districts. What was the lowest figure? That's right, from 9.5% to 39%. And it varies across rural or urban authorities. Newcastle, which is the district I'm going to talk about most in what follows, 15.7% filled it in by electronic means. So they had a unique code associated with each household, and when they went on the web, they typed that unique code in to the computer website, and they were able to fill their questionnaire in from that unique code. Comments on the website were generally favourable. It appears to have worked exceptionally well, given that it was 2 years ago when they had to do this website, and things have moved on since then. To have got a good website then was to be highly recommended. Communal establishments managed accommodation such as care homes, etc., and special groups such as travellers had their census questionnaires hand delivered. So they used people to hand deliver the question in those places and then collect them afterwards. Individuals in those establishments also had the opportunity to use the online system. Response rates. Now, any survey of any kind always has a response rate. Now, response rates vary across the whole country, and they're available on the website. The highest was 97%. The lowest was about 51%. Prior to the census, ONS set themselves a target of 94% response. They just about managed that. I think it was 93.7. While some of what I'm going to say may be familiar to some of you, very few will know what happens when a census form is returned. Not that it's anyway a secret, it's just that to most people, when the form is completed and sent off, that is the end of their involvement. The public generally do not know what happens to the form to enable ONS to get to the eventual output. It is important to appreciate that in order to get accurate figures, ONS spend a considerable amount of time doing quality control and follow-up of non-respondents with a few adjustments, e.g. amalgamations, to make the data make sense. There were obviously some people who filled it on online and some people at the same address who would fill it in by paper, especially if one person did one thing and somebody else in the household did another. It did happen, so ONS needed to remove one of those and check to see that the results were the same, and if they weren't the same, they had to work out what was correct or incorrect. That was quite a task. So ONS did expected people to return by post or through the internet, and they did daily receipting of the questionnaires. So they had an ongoing monitoring of what was returned, outstanding household questionnaires. So they had what they called a questionnaire tracking system, which they call QT. This enabled the identification of households for follow-up where a questionnaire had not been returned or completed online. Respondents sometimes make errors when recording their answers, resulting in data that were not valid for estimation and analysis. This is called item non-response. A lot of those answers would be unintentional, For example, where a respondent misses a question or thinks they can tick more than one box, or intentional, where a respondent either does not know the answer or does not want to provide the answer. Some answers were correct, but were considered inconsistent with other values in the questionnaire. So, for example, if a person aged 10 gave an occupation, these values were considered to be inconsistent because, by definition, a 10-year-old cannot be employment. That's a quote from the ONS website. This is referred to as item inconsistency. Further to this, editing and imputation. Now, imputation was something that is relatively new, so we'll come to that in a minute. Editing. The 2011 census data were edited in 2 stages to correct for item non-response and inconsistencies. A limited number of edits were applied, followed by item imputation, which corrected for non-response and inconsistencies. So the ONS had various procedures to compensate for these errors. This imputation included accounting for non-responding households. The individual material is kept secret so that it remains confidential for 100 years. However, ONS do produce tables of data at what are called small area levels. Sometime in the past, these were called enumeration districts. They are contiguous zones which were the work of a specially trained temporary census enumerator covering around 100 to 150 households. She was recruited to collect the data. These enumeration districts were nested within a local authority ward so that these could be accumulated to produce political ward figures, the local authority, the county, the region and the country. So it was a nested hierarchy. This leads to an issue that is not easy to handle. How to balance the confidentiality with the need to provide accurate figures within each table. I'm just going to mention 3 measures that we used. The first method was called binary. And what they did for that was to add -1, add 0, and add +1 randomly throughout the data. So for a given figure in a given table, you could not tell exactly how many it was, but it would be plus or minus 1, or if they've added 1, it would be sort of x plus 1 and x minus 1. So you would know roughly what it was. So that's what they did. A second method that they had was to replace all cells containing a 1 by a nothing, and all cells containing a 2 by a 3. So there were in that data set there were no 1s and there were no 2s. So and that was considered sufficient to be keep the data confidential. Then another method they used was the record swap, taking a household record out of one area and replacing it with another with similar main characteristics. So they would take one household there and one household there, and they would put them in separate areas. So the total number of people would stay the same, but the characteristics within the area would marginally be different from the actual truth. In this last case, all the numbers will add up, which is generally not the case with the first 2 methods. In my own view, of the 3 methods, there are so many other errors, many of which are hidden around the completion of a questionnaire, that which of these methods is used is really immaterial. To my mind, however, these are not always the total answer to the confidentiality issue, as we will discover later on. After the data is cleaned, It is then analysed, producing tables. For the 2001 and 2011 censuses, these tables were put on the 3 websites I mentioned earlier. Unlike in the previous censuses, the 2011 censuses are called estimates for the population figures with an associated confidence interval. The confidence interval took into account response rates, etc. Now, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to use the sheet that you have to discuss the issues with the data. As you will see on the sheet, there are 25 sections. This is the data, the census data that we have produced for Newcastle. Tyne and Wear Research and Intelligence Unit has produced this, and we've actually produced something like this for every ward in the country. So we've actually got the data and we've put it in that form. Whether people are interested in buying that, we don't know yet. We haven't got any takers. But we certainly know that some people are going to have difficulty analysing their data, so this is one source that they could use. You'll see on the top left-hand side, there's the 2011 census logo. I'm in two minds as to whether that should be on or should not be on. ONS say they like as much publicity as they can, but it's also possible that it's confidential and subject to copyright laws. But it's there. If someone tells you to take it off, I will take it off. So there are 25 sections, and some of the sections are very overlap, but they don't overlap very much. So we start with section 1, the resident population. You would think that it would be very easy to define the usual resident population, but in fact, a whole page of the census questionnaire, which has 32 pages in total, is given over to defining and clarifying who usually lives at this address. It's a whole page. I've got it here. That's the page they use. It's quite it's quite difficult to follow if you're not very literate, but you're expected to understand that, and it divides people basically into 2 types: those who are usually resident and those who are not usually resident and classified as visitors. So you're either a usually resident person or you're a visitor. So, in particular, full-time students are treated as usually resident at their term time address. Right, so if you're a student, or when you were a student, ONS would have said, okay, wherever you are, your usual residence is your term time address. But someone who works away elsewhere in the UK, who's part of a household, is treated as living at their family address. So they do one thing for one set of people, but another thing for another group of people. So if you live in Newcastle, your family lives in Newcastle, but you work in London, for usual residence purposes, you're treated as if you live in Newcastle, not in London, even though you might be in London for more of the time. For example, if you went down, you stayed the weekend here, your permanent job was in London, so you left very early Monday morning and you came back on Friday night, you actually spend more time in London than you do in Newcastle, but ONS think your main residence is in Newcastle and you're treated as if you're part of Newcastle rather than part of London. One of the consequences of that is that it in fact reduces the number of single parent households, because of course you're deemed to live in your the address where your children are, rather than in an address where you work. So if you were deemed to live at your address in London, you'd have a single parent family in replace your home instead. Does that make sense? Right. So this, in effect, you can argue about whether or not they are single parent households or not, but ONS think that they're not. And also another difficulty, who's a foreign student doing a course starting in October, finishing with a holiday at the end of August, is treated as a visitor, but someone whose course finished at the end of September would be treated as a usual resident. Because you are expected to live at your address for a year or in total. So for Newcastle, from Table 1, there were an estimated 280,177 usual residents, of whom 140,000 plus were male, nearly 140,000 female. And of these people, 271,212 lived in a household. Now, the remainder are in institutions or possibly homeless. The definition of a household is much simpler than the definition of a usually resident person in terms of the words that are used. However, a household is one person or a group of people not necessarily related, living at the same address, who share cooking facilities and share a living room or sitting room or dining area. We could discuss this later. But in fact, at the margin, it's actually quite difficult to decide if a group of people are one household or several households. If you've got a lot of students together, they may or not have a different address. If they've got a different address, then they should have, should be separate households. But what constitutes a different address is by no means clear. Section 2 gives the age structure fairly clear. As many of you will know, we are living longer, so the percentage in the older categories is largely increasing. In previous censuses, babies tended to be undercounted, and there was also an undercount of males aged 16 to 29, especially after the introduction of the poll tax. Section 3. This section gives ethnicity in large groupings. So Polish immigrants are largely treated as white, although in the overall data there are a number of subgroups. The category mixed has been growing, as have other non-white categories, as we have accepted large numbers of immigrants into the country. On this, you may have heard that the second language in this country is now Polish. And obviously that's happened since 2001. There's a lot of Polish people have come across to work in this country. Section 4 gives the religion of individuals. Unlike every other question, this is not compulsory. There is a 6% non-stated. For both Section 3 and Section 4, there are also two issues in relation to the presenting of the numbers of so-called minority groups. The first issue is where there are small numbers of a particular group. This may lead to discrimination by a larger group. The second issue is where the so-called minority are quite large and lack the ability to integrate. These also cause issues. We've not managed to live together in harmony such that we're able to live freely together, hence the concept of ghettos. Whether or not that's the case is open to debate. But whatever the case, my view would be that in either of these tables, where there are small numbers, and some districts are really small, one particular district locally has less than 10 people in one of those categories. That's the whole district. And the data is provided at ward level, and there are 17 wards. So some of those are 0, most of them are, some of them are 1, and there's a couple of 2s. So there's small numbers in those districts, in those wards. My view is that small numbers can lead to discrimination, and we should be wary of that, although ONS don't seem to be particularly bothered by it. Section 5, there are 2 questions on health, which are very much complementary. The first is a 5-point scale. The second relates to limiting activities. Nearly 80% of people who live in Newcastle said their health was good or very good. Similarly, almost 20% of people had a limiting long-term illness. Some people might like to discuss the term very bad and bad in our discussion. Those are the terms that are in the questionnaire, and are they emotive, derogatory, or what? It's an interesting issue. Section 6 mirrors Section 1. Section 7 gives the total number of households. Section 8, the average household size. The ONS website presents these results on Section 8 correct to 1 decimal place. I believe we should present these to at least 2 decimal places. If we're comparing 2 areas, there's quite a lot of difference between 2.25 and 2.34 persons per household, but both of those would be rounded to 2.3. Section 9, there's a standard occupancy measure, and this is for measuring overcrowding. It's in terms of numbers of rooms that are accessible. Section 10 gives various household types. As mentioned in the footnote, these categories are not mutually exclusive. In particular, the last 2 are within the previous line. Section 11 gives housing tenure. To avoid confusion, I've separated out the small category shared ownership. This small group are part buying their home. They're not owner-occupiers because they still have to pay rent. They're not renters in the strict sense because they have a financial stake in their property. Section 12 gives the total number of household spaces, a space which could be occupied by a household. They're not all vacant, available for another household to use. Some could be filled solely with people who are deemed not usual residents. So far, I've not been able to find on the census results figures for actual vacants. It may not be possible to produce such figures. Now, I'm running out of time. Can I carry on?
Yeah.
Is that all right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, Section 13 gives percentage of household spaces, which are 2 types. They're the easy to divide type for the purposes of this exercise. Section 14 gives car ownership, with most households in the city owning a car. Section 15 gives the economically active and inactive rates for those aged 16 to 74 for both men and women, with both sets of numbers adding up to 100%. This acts as an introduction to sections 16 and 17. Section 16 shows that as far as being employed is concerned, excluding self-employed, there is little difference between men and women. Although a lot more women work part-time. Section 17 is fairly self-explanatory. Students can fit into both questions, Section 16 and Section 17, depending on their economic activity level. Section 19 expands on Section 16, showing proportionately more men work longer hours than women, but this mirrors what we found in Section 16. Section 20 expands on Section 16 slightly, showing that overall 6.2% of those aged 16 to 74 were self-employed. If you don't mind, I'll skip section 21. If you want to talk about that in the follow-up, that would be fine. Section 22, travel to work. We've had quite a bit of debate about this, although it looks fairly straightforward, because the 2011 census allowed 2 questions, such that the responses gave works at home. This causes a little confusion with the previous census results. The larger category simply arises by asking the address of workplace, and then the response is usually works mainly at home. A significant proportion of these people also use some form of private or public transport to get to an alternative place of work. E.g., a local office, presumably as and when required. So you've got these people who work at home, but sometimes they go by car to mostly work at home, but sometimes they go by car or public transport to a place where they sort of present their results or do further things, or they're responsible. So ONS have treated them as going to work by car, even though they work mainly at home. So that's a bit of a nonsense for most people. Most people would say, well, hang on, if they only work at home, you should treat them mainly work at home. But that's what they've done. Right. On this question 22, you'll see that the first category is those who go by car, those who go by motorcycle, those who go by van, and those that go by taxi. Those are the standard ONS amalgamations. I'd like to know your views on whether taxi is a public or a private mode of transport. I'm in 2 minds. I don't know whether taxi is a public or a private mode of transport. Right. And the final 3 sections are giving details of the various industries, occupations, and socio-economic classification of jobs for city residents. As I said earlier, this is the data that we provide. It's not all the data, it's the vast majority. There are questions on linguistics and a few other questions. Whether this is the last time we'll have this kind of data at a small area level, I don't know. Is it valuable in the long term? I don't know. I know that if we have data for Birmingham as the largest district with 1 million people, and we have data for Cornwall, which has only got, the Isles of Scilly, and we have the same data, then Birmingham seems to be maltreated compared with the Isles of Scilly, because obviously Cornwall's got, Isles of Scilly has got a lot more data per individual than Birmingham has. But that was one proposal, just to provide district data. We should be using this data to inform policy and help us to know where we are as a nation and moving on. I suspect that a lot of people do not use this data to help them decide their policies, and that policies are produced using finger in the air rather than some reasonably solid data. Okay? I'm sorry I've gone on a bit longer.
Thank you very much. Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.